So, since we didn't have a ton of time to get in depth on the Watergate scandal, we're going to look at it and shoot for about 5 minutes. So, a couple things to keep in mind context wise when this happens. In light of the Pentagon Papers leak by Danny Ellsberg that exposed the sort of CIA secret version of the Vietnam War to the public, especially the expansion of bombing in Cambodia and Laos by Nixon, who campaigned on the promise of peace with honor and getting out of the Vietnam War and letting the Vietnamese take over the war for themselves. And the attempt by the Nixon administration to keep the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers, which they lost. So he already kind of has a history of secrecy and trying to suppress free speech and freedom of information by the public. This sort of special committee gets set up called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. And I think, to the best of our knowledge, it was set up without Nixon's knowledge. And he didn't set it up for himself, but rather a couple of his aides sort of set it up on his behalf. And what their big aim was with the CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President, was to not only win the 1972 election, but to win in a landslide, which they ended up doing. So in this picture, this is the file cabinet that Danny Ellsberg's psychiatrist had in his office. And one of the jobs that the CREEP guys followed up with was they broke into his psychiatrist's office and tried to steal his records and find something to discredit him, that he's crazy or schizophrenic or something like that, when he leaked the Pentagon Papers, which they were not successful in. So, in terms of what happened, June 17th, 1972, 5 guys got caught breaking into the Watergate complex, and it's got a bunch of different things in it, but most famously a hotel. And the Democratic National Committee had its headquarters there, so this is kind of like Nixon's opponent in the 1972 election. So these are the 5 guys that got caught. They had wiretapping and burglary tools on them when they were caught by a security guard and then arrested by Washington, D.C. police. One of the first things Nixon did to get in trouble is he tried to stop the CIA and the FBI from investigating what happened. And one of the questions is, did Nixon know or order the Watergate break-in? I don't know that we can answer those definitively, but we can definitively say he tried to cover it up once these guys got arrested. And if you tell the FBI not to investigate something, that's a crime, which is called obstruction of justice. So in January 1973, after he just won the 72 election in a landslide, it's not really a big story yet, and the Watergate burglars get found guilty and get sent to a couple years in prison. But what happens is one of them starts telling the judge, hey, I lied, and the government knows more than we've admitted to. There's kind of a bigger cover-up or conspiracy here besides just 5 guys breaking into a hotel on their own. And at the same time, a guy whose code name was Deep Throat, we didn't really know who he was until about 10 years ago. He was some high government official who was secretly leaking hints to 2 young reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who worked at the Washington Post, and was kind of like leaving a trail for Woodward and Bernstein to follow so that they could find other things about CREEP and other crimes that the White House was orchestrating. So basically, some of his own aides start to turn on him, and Nixon starts to look like he might be involved either in ordering Watergate or covering it up. And thanks to Deep Throat and some other sources, we find out that Nixon has been secretly taping every conversation he has in the Oval Office, partially because he's paranoid. So the Nixon tapes become this huge debate now that we know they exist in 1973. And predictably, what Nixon says is, wait a minute, this stuff's top secret. The government has to have some confidential stuff. You can't just release everything. But the public wants to hear it, so he does eventually release some of the tapes. And an example of what he released, one of the tapes had a big 18-minute clip that was missing from the middle, which looks suspicious, but we didn't know what was on it. So he fought the Supreme Court, and in a famous Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court unanimously, 8-0, ruled that Nixon had to release the entire version of the tapes, not just the redacted ones he had done earlier. And when the tapes came out, it was pretty obvious that Nixon had tried to cover up Watergate and talk to his aides about how to damage control and minimize his involvement. They didn't show that he ordered the break-in, but it showed that he tried to cover it up for sure. So what happens is the House of Representatives start moving to impeach him. And if you aren't familiar with the Constitution, to impeach a president, you need the House of Representatives to sort of indict him or send him to trial. That's called impeaching him. And they passed, I think, 3 out of 4 articles of impeachment. That doesn't mean he gets kicked out of office. That means that he goes to the Senate, and the Senate acts as his jury where he's tried. And if the Senate finds him guilty by a 2/3 majority, then he's kicked out of office. Remember, at this point in American history, only one other president had been impeached, Andrew Johnson, for failing to really bring the South in line during Reconstruction. Nixon becomes the second one. So he sees that he's getting impeached, and the Senate's probably going to find him guilty. So just like if your boss was going to fire you, it would make sense to quit before you could. In August 1974, Nixon became the first president to ever quit. What's interesting about that is his vice president, Spiro Agnew, who was a governor from Maryland, had resigned the year before for taking bribes back when he was the governor of Maryland. And so Nixon actually had Gerald Ford as his vice president, and Gerald Ford holds the distinction of being the only man not elected to the office of vice president and not elected to the office of president. He got appointed by Nixon in 1973, and Congress signed off on his appointment as vice president. But then in August of 74, about a year after he'd been on the job, he actually inherits the presidency from Nixon. Now, one of the big twists in the plot line is Gerald Ford, a month after inheriting the presidency, goes on TV and tells America that he is giving Nixon a full and absolute pardon for anything he did or might have done during his presidency, which presidents have the power to do so. So he basically says no one can investigate Nixon, you can't charge him with crimes, he can't go to jail. He kind of gets a get-out-of-jail-free card for everything that happened. So, didn't mean to go backwards. Some other things to know is Congress was, in light of the Pentagon Papers, not really trusting the president to conduct these police actions on his own. The same thing really happened in Korea, where Congress never declared war. So, as a pushback against presidential power, besides the Supreme Court cases with the Pentagon Papers and with Watergate, the Congress passed the War Powers Act of 1973 that said presidents can't fight these wars, air quote, wars, without congressional approval, and now there are limits, which we'll learn about in government class next year. And Congress also passed the Freedom of Information Act. If you ever see a government employee whose email signature says something about this email might be part of the public record, it's basically a law that says private citizens can ask to see government records as a way to increase transparency in government. And Congress also passed the Fair Campaign Practices Act, which put limits on how much money you can give to someone who's running for president. So some of the lessons from Watergate: first of all, the presidency had been getting more and more and more powerful since guys like Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century were presidents, but especially under FDR and Truman and Eisenhower, this trend had been continuing, and Nixon's the first one that really causes the power of the president to shrink because of his abuses of power, which the Pentagon Papers and Watergate definitely showed. And not only does Congress put limits on the president's power, but I think Americans stop trusting presidents unconditionally and just saying, we'll do whatever they say and believe them. People become more skeptical of government. And another question is, was it really fair that Gerald Ford pardoned him? Some people say Nixon made a deal with Ford and said, I'm going to quit and you'll be president, but I'm only going to do that if you give me a pardon. And, there's no proof of that. Gerald Ford denies that. But, I wouldn't put it past Nixon. And I think another one is that Nixon was the kind of guy that surrounded himself with really loyal, almost fiercely loyal advisors, and he was very, very secretive and paranoid. And those people, even though he may not have told them to go out and do the stuff that this creep committee did, these plumbers who were going out to fix leaks, but he definitely wasn't against what they were doing. And so I think one of the lessons there is, if you're paranoid and secret and don't trust many people, you have this really ultra loyal inner circle that sometimes those guys can go out and do things they think are good for you but end up causing you problems, like breaking into Danny Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office looking for his records and breaking into Watergate. And it's definitely the biggest scandal in American history, and that's why you see things like when the Patriots allegedly deflated some footballs, people in America always attach the suffix gate, so that was known as Deflate Gate, just like Watergate was known. So hopefully that gives you a little better understanding of the Watergate scandal and how that impacted Nixon's fall from power.